and against Kavanaugh since his nomination was announced. Well, apart from her, the only other senator who has not indicated which way he will vote at this time is Democratic Senator Joe Manchin of West Virginia. Earlier today, both senators voted yes on a key vote to advance Kavanaugh's nomination. That doesn't also mean that they will vote no in the final vote. That motion to move it forward passed 51-40, pretty much along party lines. The only Republican to vote against moving forward for his confirmation was Senator Lisa Murkowski of Alaska. Joining us now from Capitol Hill is Molly Hooper. She's a CBSN political contributor and a Capitol Hill reporter for The Hill. Molly, thank you very much for joining us. I want to actually start with Murkowski. I know that Murkowski voted no to move it forward. I know people say that's usually an indication of where she will vote. Does it mean, and have we heard anything further, that her actual vote will actually be no?
Well, it's unclear at this point, but going into the chamber, she told reporters that that essentially Brett Kavanaugh is a good man, but he's not the right man for the court at this time. And earlier on Thursday, I guess the days seem to be running together up here, but I guess yesterday on Thursday she met with sexual survivors from Alaska in her office. That may have had an impact on whether or not she wanted to move this nomination forward or not. And keep in mind, if they voted against, if the Senate decided not to move forward on this nomination, it would have been essentially a filibuster. And this way, the Senate will actually make their decision on whether to confirm or not on Saturday, possibly earlier Saturday afternoon, as late as 5:30 p.m. Saturday. And again, a lot can happen between now and then. And talking to several senators after this morning's vote, I asked, well, are you talking to Senator Murkowski, Collins? And for the most part, I heard from some Democrats and Republicans saying that we're kind of letting them keep this to their own counsel and not trying to press them either way. Earlier today, in front of Senator Manchin's office, there were a number of protesters, but soon they were cleared out, and it's a lot more quiet up here than it has been for the past 2 weeks.
You know, I was struck by what Senator Flake said, that he will vote yes on Kavanaugh unless something big happens. Molly, is there something more you should read into that? Is he huddling with other senators? Who has he been talking to recently?
Actually, in this process, each day seems like a lifetime, and you never know what's going to happen or unfold. So I think after learning, after essentially the 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks, September 14th, the week of September 13th, 14th, when the revelation that there was in fact somebody who had alleged that Kavanaugh had allegations that Kavanaugh had committed sexual assault when he was in high school, I think that most senators are caveating their answers with barring anything unforeseen, because they did not, many of them, Republicans and Democrats, did not see that letter coming out or the allegations coming out sort of at the 11th hour. So I think that that's something, a CY rear end, if you will,
gotcha,
up here until the final vote happens.
Molly, so when you talk about Collins here, which is the vote that we're all watching, eager to hear what she might have to say, yes, have you been tipped any way? Do you know what her thinking is? And what is she facing when it comes to looking at domestic, local politics back home?
Well, she doesn't have re-election until 2022, and already one of the House members who could be a potential opponent, Shelley Pingree, said that if Susan Collins was going to vote would vote for Kavanaugh, Shelley would get into the race. But at the same time, Susan Collins has been facing a lot of pressure from the folks who are against Kavanaugh. They've been sending wire coat hangers wire hangers to her office, threatening members of her female staffers. Reports that one female staffer was threatened, one anti-Kavanaugh protester threatened to rape one of Collins's female staffers, and really, I think that when it comes to Collins, she says she's not going to be bowed either way, but there have been a very aggressive tactics, to force Collins to vote against Kavanaugh. And again, I think that Collins is one of those people who is not going to be bowing to either party or either side. I mean, if you look at her record, she's always been in one of the quote unquote gangs up here on Capitol Hill. And usually you have a gang when there's a divisive issue and you need Republicans and Democrats to come together in the middle. She's always been one of those brokers, deal brokers, and she isn't swayed necessarily by
Molly, I'm sorry to interrupt you. We've got Susan Collins.
Direction.
I apologize. We have got Susan Collins right now.
Of course.
We're going to allow her to speak and hear what she has to say on this vote on Kavanaugh.
In the gallery. Sergeant. As a reminder to our guests in the galleries, expressions of approval or disapproval are not permitted in the Senate galleries. The senator for Maine.
Mr. President. Mr. President, the 5 previous times that I've come to the floor to explain my vote on the nomination of a justice to the United States Supreme Court, I have begun my floor remarks explaining my decision with a recognition of the solemn nature and the importance of the occasion. But today, we have come to the conclusion of a confirmation process that has become so dysfunctional, it looks more like a caricature of a gutter-level political campaign than a solemn occasion. The president nominated Brett Kavanaugh on July 9th. Within moments of that announcement, special interest groups raced to be the first to oppose him, including one organization that didn't even bother to fill in the judge's name on its pre-written press release. They simply wrote that they opposed Donald Trump's nomination of XX to the Supreme Court of the United States. A number of senators joined the race to announce their opposition, but they were beaten to the punch by one of our colleagues who actually announced opposition before the nominee's identity was even known. Since that time, we have seen special interest groups whip their followers into a frenzy by spreading misrepresentations and outright falsehoods about Judge Kavanaugh's judicial record. Over-the-top rhetoric and distortions of his record and testimony at his first hearing produced short-lived headlines which, although debunked hours later, continued to live on and be spread through social media. Interest groups have also spent an unprecedented amount of dark money opposing this nomination. Our Supreme Court confirmation process has been in steady decline for more than 30 years. One can only hope that the Kavanaugh nomination is where the process has finally hit rock bottom. Against this backdrop, it is up to each individual senator to decide what the Constitution's advice and consent duty means. Informed by Alexander Hamilton's Federalist 76, I have interpreted this to mean that the president has broad discretion to consider a nominee's philosophy, whereas my duty as a senator is to focus on the nominee's qualifications as long as that nominee's philosophy is within the mainstream of judicial thought. I have always opposed litmus tests for judicial nominees with respect to their personal views or politics, but I fully expect them to be able to put aside any and all personal preferences in deciding the cases that come before them. I've never considered the president's identity or party when evaluating Supreme Court nominations. As a result, I voted in favor of Justices Roberts and Alito, who were nominated by President Bush, Justices Sotomayor and Kagan, who were nominated by President Obama, and Justice Gorsuch, who was nominated by President Trump. So I began my evaluation of Judge Kavanaugh's nomination by reviewing his 12-year record on the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals, including his more than 300 opinions and his many speeches and law review articles. 19 attorneys, including lawyers from the nonpartisan Congressional Research Service, briefed me many times each week and assisted me in evaluating the judge's extensive record. I met with Judge Kavanaugh for more than 2 hours in my office. I listened carefully to the testimony at the committee hearings. I spoke with people who knew him personally, such as Condoleezza Rice and many others. And I talked with Judge Kavanaugh a second time by phone for another hour to ask him very specific additional questions. I also have met with thousands of my constituents, both advocates and many opponents, regarding Judge Kavanaugh. One concern that I frequently heard was that the judge would be likely to eliminate the Affordable Care Act's vital protections for people with pre-existing conditions. I disagree with this contention. In a dissent in Seven Sky v. Holder, Judge Kavanaugh rejected a challenge to the ACA on narrow procedural grounds, preserving the law in full. Many experts have said that his dissent informed Justice Roberts' opinion upholding the ACA at the Supreme Court. Furthermore, Judge Kavanaugh's approach toward the doctrine of severability is narrow. When a part of a statute is challenged on constitutional grounds, he has argued for severing the invalid clause as surgically as possible while allowing the overall law to remain intact. This was his approach in his dissent in a case that involved a challenge to the structure of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. In his dissent, Judge Kavanaugh argued for, quote, severing any problematic portions while leaving the remainder intact, end quote. Given the current challenges to the ACA, proponents, including myself, of protections for people with pre-existing conditions should want a justice who would take just this kind of approach. Another assertion that I've heard often is that Judge Kavanaugh cannot be trusted if a case involving alleged wrongdoing by the president were to come before the court. The basis for this argument seems to be twofold. First, Judge Kavanaugh has written that he believes that Congress should enact legislation to protect presidents from criminal prosecution or civil liability while in office. Mr. President, I believe opponents missed the mark on this issue. The fact that Judge Kavanaugh offered this legislative proposal suggests that he believes that the president does not have such protection currently. Second, there are some who argue that given the current special counsel investigation, President Trump should not even be allowed to nominate a justice. That argument ignores our recent history. President Clinton in 1993 nominated Justice Ginsburg after the Whitewater investigation was already underway, and she was confirmed 96-3. The next year, just 3 months after independent counsel Robert Fisk was named to lead the Whitewater investigation, President Clinton nominated Justice Breyer. He was confirmed 87-9. Supreme Court justices have not hesitated to rule against the presidents who have nominated them. Perhaps most notably in the United States versus Nixon, 3 Nixon appointees who heard the case joined the unanimous opinion against him. Judge Kavanaugh has been unequivocal in his belief that no president is above the law. He has stated that Marbury versus Madison, Youngstown Steel versus Sawyer, and the United States versus Nixon are 3 of the 4 greatest Supreme Court cases in history. What do they have in common? Each of them is a case where Congress served as a check on presidential power. And I would note that the 4th case that Judge Kavanaugh has pointed to as the greatest in history was Brown versus the Board of Education. One Kavanaugh decision illustrates the point about the check on presidential power directly. He wrote the opinion in Hamdan versus the United States, a case that challenges the Bush administration's military commission prosecution of an associate of Osama bin Laden. This conviction was very important to the Bush administration, but Judge Kavanaugh, who had been appointed to the D.C. Circuit by President Bush and had worked in President Bush's White House, ruled that the conviction was unlawful. As he explained during the hearing, quote, "We don't make decisions based on who people are or their policy preferences or the moment. We base decisions on the law," end quote. Others I've met with have expressed concerns that Justice Kennedy's retirement threatens the right of same-sex couples to marry. Yet Judge Kavanaugh described the Obergefell decision, which legalized same-gender marriages, as an important landmark precedent. He also cited Justice Kennedy's recent masterpiece cake shop opinion for the court's majority, stating that, quote, "The days of treating gay and lesbian Americans or gay and lesbian couples as second-class citizens who are inferior in dignity and worth are over in the Supreme Court," end quote. Others have suggested that the judge holds extreme views on birth control. In one case, Judge Kavanaugh incurred the disfavor of both sides of the political spectrum for seeking to ensure the availability of contraceptive services for women while minimizing the involvement of employers with religious objections. Although his critics frequently overlooked this point, Judge Kavanaugh's dissent rejected arguments that the government did not have a compelling interest in facilitating access to contraception. In fact, he wrote that the Supreme Court precedent strongly suggested that there was a compelling interest in facilitating access to birth control. There has also been considerable focus on the future of abortion rights based on the concern that Judge Kavanaugh would seek to overturn Roe v. Wade. Protecting this right is important to me. To my knowledge, Judge Kavanaugh is the first Supreme Court nominee to express the view that precedent is not merely a practice and tradition, but rooted in Article 3 of our Constitution itself. He believes that precedent is not just a judicial policy, it is constitutionally dictated to pay attention and pay heed to rules of precedent. In other words, precedent isn't a goal or an aspiration. It is a constitutional tenet that has to be followed except in the most extraordinary circumstances. The judge further explained that precedent provides stability, predictability, reliance, and fairness. There are, of course, rare and extraordinary times where the Supreme Court would rightly overturn a precedent. The most famous example was when the Supreme Court in Brown versus the Board of Education overruled Plessy versus Ferguson, correcting a grievously wrong decision, to use the judge's term, allowing racial inequality. But someone who believes that the importance of precedent has been rooted in the Constitution would follow long-established precedent, except in those rare circumstances where a decision is grievously wrong or deeply inconsistent with the law. Those are Judge Kavanaugh's phrases. As the judge asserted to me, a long-established precedent is not something to be trimmed, narrowed, discarded, or overlooked. Its roots in the Constitution give the concept of stare decisis greater weight, such that the precedent can't be trimmed or narrowed simply because a judge might want to on a whim. In short, his views on honoring precedent would preclude attempts to do by stealth that which one has committed not to do overtly. Noting that Roe v. Wade was decided 45 years ago and reaffirmed 19 years later in Planned Parenthood versus Casey, I asked Judge Kavanaugh whether the passage of time is relevant to following precedent. He said decisions become part of our legal framework with the passage of time, and that honoring precedent is essential to maintaining public confidence. Our discussion then turned to the right of privacy, on which the Supreme Court relied in Griswold versus Connecticut, a case that struck down a law banning the use and sale of contraceptions. Griswold established the legal foundation that led to Roe 8 years later. In describing Griswold as settled law, Judge Kavanaugh observed that it was the correct application of two famous cases from the 1920s, Meyer and Pierce, that are not seriously challenged by anyone today. Finally, in his testimony, he noted repeatedly that Roe had been upheld by Planned Parenthood versus Casey, describing it as precedent on precedent. When I asked him, would it be sufficient to overturn a long-established precedent if 5 current justices believed that it was wrongly decided? He emphatically said no. Opponents frequently cite then-candidate Donald Trump's campaign pledge to nominate only judges who would overturn Roe. The Republican platform for all presidential campaigns has included this pledge since at least 1980. During this time, Republican presidents have appointed Justices O'Connor, Souter, and Kennedy to the Supreme Court. These are the very 3 justices, Republican president-appointed justices, who authored the Casey decision which reaffirmed Roe. Furthermore, pro-choice groups vigorously opposed each of these justices' nominations. Incredibly, they even circulated buttons with the slogan, "Stop Souter or women will die." Just 2 years later, Justice Souter co-authored the Casey opinion, reaffirming a woman's right to choose. Suffice it to say, prominent advocacy organizations have been wrong. These same interest groups have speculated that Judge Kavanaugh was selected to do the bidding of conservative ideologues despite his record of judicial independence. I asked the judge point blank whether he had made any commitments or pledges to anyone at the White House, to the Federalist Society, to any outside group on how he would decide cases. He unequivocally assured me that he had not. Judge Kavanaugh has received rave reviews for his 12-year track record as a judge, including for his judicial temperament. The American Bar Association gave him its highest possible rating. Its Standing Committee on the Federal Judiciary conducted an extraordinarily thorough assessment, soliciting input from almost 500 people, including his judicial colleagues. The ABA concluded that his integrity, judicial temperament, and professional competence met the highest standards. Lisa Blatt, who has argued more cases before the Supreme Court than any other woman in history, testified, quote, "By any objective measure, Judge Kavanaugh is clearly qualified to serve on the Supreme Court. His opinions are invariably thoughtful and fair." Ms. Blatt, who clerked for and is an ardent admirer of Justice Ginsburg, and who is, in her own words, an unapologetic defender of a woman's right to choose, says that Judge Kavanaugh fits within the mainstream of legal thought. She also observed that Judge Kavanaugh is remarkably committed to promoting women in the legal profession. That Judge Kavanaugh is more of a centrist than some of his critics maintain is reflected in the fact that he and Chief Judge Merrick Garland voted the same way in 93% of the cases that they heard together. Indeed, Chief Judge Garland joined in more than 96% of the majority opinions authored by Judge Kavanaugh, dissenting only once. Despite all this, after weeks of reviewing Judge Kavanaugh's record and listening to 32 hours of his testimony, the Senate's advice and consent role was thrown into a tailspin following the allegations of sexual assault by Professor Christine Blasey Ford. The confirmation process now involves evaluating whether or not Judge Kavanaugh committed sexual assault and lied about it to the Judiciary Committee. Some argue that because this is a lifetime appointment to our highest court, the public interest requires that doubts be resolved against the nominee. Others see the public interest as embodied in our long-established tradition of affording to those accused of misconduct a presumption of innocence. In cases in which the facts are unclear, they would argue that the question should be resolved in favor of the nominee. Mr. President, I understand both viewpoints. This debate is complicated further by the fact that the Senate confirmation process is not a trial. But certain fundamental legal principles about due process, the presumption of innocence, and fairness do bear on my thinking, and I cannot abandon them. In evaluating any given claim of misconduct, we will be ill-served in the long run if we abandon the presumption of innocence and fairness, tempting though it may be. We must always remember that it is when passions are most inflamed that fairness is most in jeopardy. The presumption of innocence is relevant to the advice and consent function when an accusation departs from a nominee's otherwise exemplary record. I worry that departing from this presumption could lead to a lack of public faith in the judiciary and would be hugely damaging to the confirmation process moving forward. Some of the allegations levied against Judge Kavanaugh illustrate why the presumption of innocence is so important. I am thinking in particular not of the allegations raised by Professor Ford, but of the allegation that when he was a teenager, Judge Kavanaugh drugged multiple girls and used their weakened state to facilitate gang rape. This outlandish allegation was put forth without any credible supporting evidence and simply parroted public statements of others. That such an allegation can find its way into the Supreme Court confirmation process is a stark reminder about why the presumption of innocence is so ingrained in our American consciousness. Mr. President, I listened carefully to Christine Blasey Ford's testimony before the Judiciary Committee. I found her testimony to be sincere, painful, and compelling. I believe that she is a survivor of a sexual assault and that this trauma has upended her life. Nevertheless, the 4 witnesses she named could not corroborate any of the events of that evening gathering where she says the assault occurred. None of the individuals Professor Ford says were at the party has any recollection at all of that night. Judge Kavanaugh forcefully denied the allegations under penalty of perjury. Mark Judge denied under penalty of felony that he had witnessed an assault. P.J. Smith, another person allegedly at the party, denied that he was there under penalty of felony. Professor Ford's lifelong friend, Leland Kaiser, indicated that under penalty of felony, she does not remember that party. And Ms. Kaiser went further. She indicated that not only does she not remember a night like that, but also that she does not even know Brett Kavanaugh. In addition to the lack of corroborating evidence, we also learned some facts that raise more questions. For instance, since these allegations have become public, Professor Ford testified that not a single person has contacted her to say, I was at the party that night. Furthermore, the professor testified that although she does not remember how she got home that evening, she knew that because of the distance, she would have needed a ride. Yet not a single person has come forward to say that they were the one who drove her home or were in the car with her that night. And Professor Ford also indicated that even though she left that small gathering of 6 or so people abruptly and without saying goodbye and distraught, none of them called her the next day or ever to ask why she left. Is she okay? Not even her closest friend, Ms. Kaiser. Mr. President, the Constitution does not provide guidance on how we are supposed to evaluate these competing claims. It leaves that decision up to each senator. This is not a criminal trial, and I do not believe that the claims such as these need to be proved beyond a reasonable doubt. Nevertheless, fairness would dictate that the claims at least should meet a threshold of more likely than not as our standard. The facts presented do not mean that Professor Ford was not sexually assaulted that night or at some other time, but they do lead me to conclude that the allegations failed to meet the more likely than not standard. Therefore, I do not believe that these charges can fairly prevent Judge Kavanaugh from serving on the court. Let me emphasize that my approach to this question should not be misconstrued as suggesting that unwanted sexual contact of any nature is not a serious problem in this country. To the contrary, if any good at all has come from this ugly confirmation process, it has been to create an awareness that we have underestimated the pervasiveness of this terrible problem. I have been alarmed and disturbed, however, by some who have suggested that unless Judge Kavanaugh's nomination is rejected, the Senate is somehow condoning sexual assault. Nothing could be further from the truth. Every person, man or woman, who makes a charge of sexual assault deserves to be heard and treated with respect. The Me Too movement is real. It matters, it is needed, and it is long overdue. We know that rape and sexual assault are less likely to be reported to the police than other forms of assault. On average, an estimated 211,000 rapes and sexual assaults go unreported every year. We must listen to survivors, and every day we must seek to stop the criminal behavior that has hurt so many. We owe this to ourselves, our children, and generations to come. Since the hearing, I have listened to many survivors of sexual assault. Many were total strangers who told me their heart-wrenching stories for the first time in their lives. Some were friends that I had known for decades, yet with the exception of one woman who had confided in me years ago, I had no idea that they had been the victims of sexual attacks. I am grateful for their courage and their willingness to come forward, and I hope that in heightening public awareness, they have also lightened the burden that they have been quietly bearing for so many years. To them, I pledge to do all that I can to ensure that their daughters and granddaughters never share their experiences. Over the past few weeks, I have been emphatic that the Senate has an obligation to investigate and evaluate the serious allegations of sexual assault. I called for and supported the additional hearing to hear from both Professor Ford and Judge Kavanaugh. I also pushed for and supported the FBI's supplemental background investigation. This was the right thing to do. Christine Ford never sought the spotlight. She indicated that she was terrified to appear before the Senate Judiciary Committee, and she has shunned attention since then. She seemed completely unaware of Chairman Grassley's offer to allow her to testify confidentially in California. Watching her, Mr. President, I could not help but feel that some people who wanted to engineer the defeat of this nomination cared little, if at all, for her well-being. Professor Ford testified that a very limited number of people had access to her letter. Yet that letter found its way into the public domain. She testified that she never gave permission for that very private letter to be released. And yet, here we are. We are in the middle of a fight that she never sought, arguing about claims that she wanted to raise confidentially. Now, one theory I've heard espoused repeatedly is that our colleague, Senator Feinstein, leaked Professor Ford's letter at the 11th hour to derail this process. I want to state this very clearly. I know Senator Dianne Feinstein extremely well, and I believe that she would never do that. I knew that to be the case before she even stated it at the hearing. She is a person of integrity, and I stand by her. I have also heard some argue that the chairman of the committee somehow treated Professor Ford unfairly. Nothing could be further from the truth. Chairman Grassley, along with his excellent staff, treated Professor Ford with compassion and respect throughout the entire process. And that is the way the senator from Iowa has conducted himself throughout a lifetime dedicated to public service. But the fact remains, Mr. President, someone leaked this letter against Professor Ford's express wishes. I suspect, regrettably, that we will never know for certain who did it. To that leaker, who I hope is listening now, let me say that what you did was unconscionable. You have taken a survivor who was not only entitled to your respect, but who also trusted you to protect her. And you have sacrificed her well-being in a misguided attempt to win whatever political crusade you think you are fighting. My only hope is that your callous act has turned this process into such a dysfunctional circus that it will cause the Senate, and indeed all Americans, to reconsider how we evaluate Supreme Court nominees. If that happens, then the appalling lack of compassion you afforded Professor Ford will at least have some unintended positive consequences. Mr. President, the politically charged atmosphere surrounding this nomination has reached a fever pitch even before these allegations were known, and it has been challenging, even then, to separate fact from fiction. We live in a time of such great disunity as the bitter fight over this nomination, both in the Senate and among the public, clearly demonstrates. It is not merely a case of differing groups having different opinions. It is a case of people bearing extreme ill will toward those who disagree with them. In our intense focus on our differences, we have forgotten the common values that bind us together as Americans. When some of our best minds are seeking to develop even more sophisticated algorithms designed to link us to websites that only reinforce and cater to our views, we can only expect our differences to intensify. This would have alarmed the drafters of our Constitution, who were acutely aware that different values and interests could prevent Americans from becoming and remaining a single people. Indeed, of the 6 objectives they invoked in the preamble to the Constitution, the one that they put first was the formation of a more perfect union. Their vision of a more perfect union does not exist today. And if anything, we appear to be moving farther away from it. It is particularly worrisome that the Supreme Court, the institution that most Americans see as the principal guardian of our shared constitutional heritage, is viewed as part of the problem through a political lens. Mr. President, we've heard a lot of charges and countercharges about Judge Kavanaugh. But as those who have known him best have attested, he has been an exemplary public servant, judge, teacher, coach, husband, and father. Despite the turbulent, bitter fights surrounding his nomination, my fervent hope is that Brett Kavanaugh will work to lessen the divisions in the Supreme Court so that we have far fewer 5-4 decisions, and so that public confidence in our judiciary and our highest court is restored. Mr. President, I will vote to confirm Judge Kavanaugh. Thank you, Mr. President.
President. Mr. President.
The senator for Tennessee.
Mr. President, it is sometimes said that today's
22 years in the U.S. Senate. Today, Senator Susan Collins announces she will vote yes on Brett Kavanaugh's nomination, making it very likely that Kavanaugh will make it to the Supreme Court. I want to bring in Molly Hooper, CBSN political contributor and a Capitol Hill reporter for The Hill. Molly, when you hear what she had to say,
yes.
She said she looked at his 12-year record. She also said that the Senate confirmation process is not a trial. What do you make of what she had to say in what was almost an hour-long speech?
Well, I mean, you want to talk about filibusters, that was a filibuster, you could say. And she actually laid out her arguments in favor of Kavanaugh in the lead up to the discussion before she even got to what she called a tailspin of the sexual assault allegations, going through the cases that Democrats in particular and opponents of Judge Kavanaugh pointed to as, possibly, appointing somebody to the bench who would overturn key issues like Roe v. Wade. Well, she went through a whole litany of cases that he's decided on, in which, he essentially upheld those items. She also talked about the issue of presidential authority and what some Democrats are calling the imperial presidency, with Donald Trump saying that he couldn't be indicted. A sitting president doesn't have to respond to subpoena requests for interviews. Well, again, Susan Collins listed, listed cases in Kavanaugh's background in his 12 years as a judge on the D.C. appellate court, where it would seem to be he took a differing opinion of that. And then she got to the allegations of sexual assault. And it's one of those things where I was talking to Bob Corker earlier this week. After just before the FBI the supplemental investigation was available to senators, and he was saying to me that the Democrats and the opponents of Kavanaugh have overplayed their hand. On Tuesday even, he was saying that the momentum is at the back of Kavanaugh's confirmation because these protester tactics, going up to senators and really questioning them without allowing the senators to respond, that's turning senators off. In addition to which, you look at what Collins did say about the lack of corroboration, she said, on the part of the named individuals who would have been there at that party that Dr. Blasey Ford mentioned where this sexual assault would have taken place. There was no corroboration, and Susan Collins said this is not a court, but there is something about this country. We're about fairness in this country, and you have to be able to back something up. And based on her, she laid it out, a very thorough case why she was voting this way. But again, she did end her remarks, well, maybe 3/4 through. She said the one good thing that's come out of this Dr. Ford, these Dr. Ford allegations, is the number of women who felt empowered to come forward and say this has happened to me as well, and to tell their tales when they haven't been able to do that to this point. And Collins, she made a commitment to do whatever she can to help make the future safe for young women in this country, so that these sexual assaults won't take place. And that's something that I think people up here on Capitol Hill will hold her to.
Certainly will. She's up for re-election in 2020. I'm already seeing people on the left calling for someone very strong to replace her. But Molly, I want to talk to you sort of about the moment at hand right now, the math. Can you walk us through the math right now? Is it certain at this point that Judge Kavanaugh will make it through, or are we still waiting on some other votes?
It's looking pretty good for Kavanaugh because Collins was that key vote. There are 51 Republicans, 49 Democrats. Well, there's 47 Democrats, 2 independents who often side with the Democrats. And Murkowski has said, well, she voted for cloture, so they're basically discounting her vote. So that's 50 votes against, okay? With Collins saying she will vote for Kavanaugh, Flake saying he will vote for Kavanaugh, barring anything that happens in the next few hours, that puts the vote at 50-50, and Mike Pence, Vice President Mike Pence, is on hand to break a tie. So at this point, it does look like Kavanaugh has the votes. Again, you've got that caveat from Flake, and who knows? We still don't know what Joe Manchin's going to do. He could vote for it. He could vote for the Kavanaugh confirmation. And even though you had several Democrats like Heidi Heitkamp, Joe Donnelly, Claire McCaskill, probably not as much Claire McCaskill, but other Democrats who are in those so-called red states that President Trump won by double digits, they voted against cloture, but they still have a chance to vote on confirmation, and it's unclear how they will vote.
As you mentioned, we are waiting to hear from Senator Manchin. We are expecting him to speak possibly any time now. We'll bring that to you live. But we are hearing reports that he is expected to vote yes, Molly. CBS News has not confirmed that. If that is in fact true, Molly, what do you make of that?
I think that's right. I mean, all signs kind of pointed to him voting for it, and the fact that he did not cross the line. Well, probably according to his leaders, his Democratic leaders, he crossed the line, but he did cross the aisle and vote for cloture. That's a big deal,
Molly. And I just want to confirm right now.
Cloture is. Yep.
I apologize to interrupt you, but CBS News has confirmed that Senator Joe Manchin will in fact vote yes on Judge Kavanaugh.
Okay, and that I actually kind of figured that's probably where he was going. Again, these members have to get reelected, and he's up for reelection in a state that voted heavily for President Trump. And Joe Manchin, I mean, if you look at the issues that the arguments that Collins laid out comprehensively for the past 45 minutes, those could also apply to Joe Manchin's arguments, one would think. But again, he's been keeping his powder very dry. Yeah.
Molly, do you know about the deliberation? How closely, how much do we know? Were they communicating? Collins, Murkowski, Manchin? Do we know how often they were in communication? And were they expected to sort of vote similarly?
Well, here's what's kind of interesting what happened. So the Thursday after the hearing, immediately after the hearing, you had Lisa Murkowski, Susan Collins, Jeff Flake, Joe Manchin all meeting to have a confab behind closed doors. I believe it was in Susan Collins' office. Each senator has a quote-unquote hideaway in the actual Capitol building. And they met there before the Senate Republicans held their basically larger confab to figure out where everybody was. Well, the thing is that the next day, that's when Jeff Flake made this bipartisan move to vote in favor of moving the confirmation to the Senate floor with a favorable recommendation, but basically putting a pause and calling for that FBI supplemental. And based on what he's said since then and what Susan Collins was saying, they wanted that group in particular wanted to have an additional FBI investigation, at least to have the FBI talk to those key individuals mentioned by Dr. Christine Ford, Mark Judge, P.J. Smith, and Leland Kaiser, to have them at least have a conversation with the FBI, find out what exactly was said, and then move on from there. So it's unclear if they're talking one-on-one at this point, but after that cloture vote, it's pretty much any man for himself.
So, Molly, walk us through sort of the procedural. You know what? We actually have Senator Manchin of West Virginia, who moments ago said he will, in fact, cross party lines and vote yes on Kavanaugh.
First of all, I saw that Senator Collins, I wanted out of respect, I wanted to watch her give hers, and she asked to do that. And I knew when I saw she was going to do that, I said, fine, I'll watch her. And then I made my decision, and I gave my reasons for my decision. Ours went out, and I wanted to make sure.
Are you concerned with the people here?
Sure. No, I'm very much concerned, basically, with the sexual abuse that people have had to endure, and very much concerned that we have to do something as a country. But I had to deal with the facts I had in front of me.
Would you
be willing to be the fifth vote for Judge Kavanaugh?
I just, I never thought of it basically 50, 51, 52, whatever would have happened. I says, I had to do and vote on the facts I had in front of me. If I had been in that position, I would have liked to have brought this place back to normal procedure if I'd have had that opportunity to a 60-vote threshold.
But why did you wait? Why did you wait for Collins to make her announcement before you made your announcement?
I think that was basically what was. I saw her announcement that she was going to say that she would do that.
But did you follow her? Did you decide to vote that way? Because
no, I never. Oh, no. I think everyone labored with this. Everybody labored with this decision, and we all did our own. We done due diligence. I was all morning long. Everything.
Senator Murkowski not voting with her party affect your decision? How does Senator Murkowski voting no affect your decision at all, creating a bipartisan on both sides?
Senator Murkowski is a very, 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 very dear friend of mine, very dear friend of mine, and she did everything, crossed every T, dotted every I. She went through the same process we all did. She came to a different conclusion. I came to my conclusion really this morning when I went through another hour and a half of reading the FBI report.
The allegations?
Do you believe Dr. Ford?
I believe Dr. Ford. Something happened to Dr. Ford. I don't believe that the facts showed that it was Brett Kavanaugh, but I believe something happened.
You think it was someone else who did it?
I think something happened to her. There was no way at all that we could see.
Senator, what do you say to women who watch this process unfold, heard Dr. Ford's story, and feel like Judge Kavanaugh is getting confirmed anyway, even though they've stepped forward, and that the Senate is essentially slapping
I've had people all over West Virginia come forward, and I have the greatest, just the respect, but also just basically the hurt that people have, the trauma they've gone through, and I don't know, I have empathy and sympathy, and I do anything I can to make sure that they are heard and make sure this doesn't continue.
Do you think this is an adequate FBI investigation into?
I can only have what's in front of me. That's all I have in front of me.
Based on what you've seen,
interviewed for the FBI investigation?
I'm sorry, what was that?
Do you think there should have been more witnesses interviewed for the FBI investigation?
I think that, there's always more that could have been done, I guess, if people are looking at it. I looked at what was in front of me, and I had to make a decision.
But based on what you've seen, was that a thorough investigation?
It was from my standpoint, it was thorough from what I saw. The people that I was concerned about, how they said and what they said and how they did it, I did.
Senator, do you think that there's still a place in the Democratic Party for you after this?
Whoa!
I'm just a West Virginian. I'm just a good old West Virginian.
But you're up for re-election in a difficult race. Are you concerned the base?
I didn't look at this from a political standpoint.
I
didn't do that.
Are you concerned with Kavanaugh's temperament at all? I know some Democrats have expressed concern with Kavanaugh's temperament.
The Thursday bothered me. The Thursday bothered me a lot. But I saw that basically a different side.
Shame on you! Shame on you! Shame on you! Shame on you!
Senator Joe Manchin explaining why he chose to cross party lines and will be voting yes on Judge Kavanaugh. He said when asked if he believed that Democrats should vote for him, he said, "I'm just a West Virginian." Molly, I'm sure you could hear it right there. It was hard to actually hear Manchin because you could hear protesters saying shame, 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 completely overpowering most of what we could hear in that interview. But I want to bring in CBSN political contributor and Capitol Hill reporter for The Hill, Molly Hooper. Molly, your thoughts on what we heard or what you could hear from Senator Manchin?
Well, a few things are going on here. Number one, hearing those protesters in the background, that's something that senators have been facing for the past 2 weeks, and they've been facing it daily. In fact, I've covered Capitol Hill for quite a long time, as you know, Rena.
Yes,
and I've never seen it quite so. The aggressive nature of the protesters really getting in the face of senators and members of the House to the point where, Capitol Police are around on hand so that a senator can basically say, hey, yes, this person's impeding my ability to do my job. So that's one thing. Number two, talking to other senators, somebody asked him, do you not believe the survivors? To which Joe Manchin essentially said, I've heard a lot of heartfelt stories, but that's not necessarily what this is about because we don't have the corroborating. In fact, he said that there isn't corroborating evidence that what Dr. Ford is alleging happened to her by Judge Kavanaugh actually did in fact happen. And that factors into the decision that these members are going to be making. And number three, earlier today, again, when Senator Manchin crossed party lines and voted for that procedural vote to cloture, to end debate. That's a big deal when it comes to Capitol Hill. Usually those votes are party line votes because they are procedural and you want to stick with your party. Essentially, his vote was to give up, to give control of the floor back to the Republicans and to let that move forward. So that was a big move earlier today, and it sort of projected how he would vote for the final confirmation. But again, this has just been a very tough issue, as Susan Collins was saying, in that you do have people up here on Capitol Hill, as Bob Corker was saying to me, people who've taken the day off of their jobs come up because this issue, something happened in their past. This issue has just dredged it all up again, and they had to come up and talk to a senator and tell them why they opposed Brett Kavanaugh's nomination. But again, he also said some of these other protesters up here who are just getting in your face and preventing us from doing our job, that's not what this is. And so I think that's partially in the back of some of these senators' minds, but more so it's they have to represent their constituents.
Molly, we're getting some reaction from Capitol Hill from fellow Republican senators, including Senator Cornyn, who says, I'm proud of Senator Collins for resisting the intimidation. Folks on the right really believed that this was an innocent man, a man who had great judicial review, someone who had judicial temperament, who had worked hard to get to this level, and not everyone believed Dr. Ford's testimony. What does it mean? Even though Susan Collins has said she does believe in the Me Too movement, and casting this vote does not mean that she's against the Me Too movement, it's really hard as you're watching the reaction on social media right now, seeing women say, if you really believed in the Me Too movement, this is not how you would cast your vote.
Well, again, you have to listen to those senators, and I go back to Bob Corker because he's really a middle-of-the-road guy. I mean, he said he's spoken out more times against President Trump than some Democrats have. But again, when it comes down to this issue, and again, he was one of the first Republicans to call for a delay in Kavanaugh's nomination in order to have a hearing to hear from Dr. Ford, or a private meeting, whatever it was, but to have Dr. Ford tell her stories to the senators in the Judiciary Committee who would be voting, and ultimately to the Senate as a body that would be voting. And he said, there are these intimidation tactics going on here, and really differentiated between, the protesters who are up here every day, in your face and exposing people's home addresses and whatnot, and those people who come up and are talking one-on-one with senators and saying, please, this is why I oppose him. At the same time, though, you do hear from those senators like Susan Collins, like Bob Corker, who say there isn't corroborating evidence that this happened. And in this country, you're innocent until proven guilty. This is not a court. This is not a criminal court. But in denying somebody a job based on allegations from 40 years ago that can't be corroborated, it sets a difficult precedent for individuals who would want to come forward and be nominees in the future. Why put yourself through that when you don't know what's going to come at you, true or not? And again, it's unclear if these are true or not. So at this point, I think that's what I'm hearing senators say. You'll hear varying degrees of that, but for the folks in the middle, like Susan Collins, Lisa Murkowski to a certain extent, but Joe Manchin, it's really the presumption of innocence until proven guilty, and the way that certain Democrats handled the hearing and those allegations.
All right, Molly Hooper, I want to thank you so much for breaking this down and joining us in this very big moment. CBS News political contributor and Republican strategist Leslie Sanchez joins us now, as well as Democratic strategist Linda Tran, who's also a CBSN political contributor. Linda, I want to get to you first, because we have talked about what issues mobilize voters come midterms. Is this going to be an issue that's going to mobilize the left?
Well, ordinarily,